So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Rich to offer his reflections on digital authority and his reading of chapter 1, which was really laying out some of these concepts of authority in a digital age and how authority might differ.
And so I've read the chapter 1, bravo, I enjoyed it a lot. I like the way that you set up Weber against Foucault. The discussion of relational authority is also quite interesting and aligned with my thinking. In my own mushier version of all of this, I've often thought that understanding the interaction between the leader and the followers is essential. And I think that that's one of the things that I pick up on a lot. This tracks onto your idea of relational authority. I also see that the Weberian and Foucaultian, I don't know how you make that word, versions of are folded into this. Thus, I like your sharper focus on the different dimensions. One of the things that I think of in all of this interactive relational form of authority is not only the role of the leader, it's important to consider, but it's also that of the follower. And that's one of the things I think that I keep coming back to. In all of this, there's a situation where the situation of both the leader and the followers. In addition, there's an interaction between those two. There's an interaction between the leader and the followers. And there's the interaction and the social dynamics among the followers themselves and how their interactions support one another, one or another form of authority. Indeed, the social dynamics of the followers are a key element in the ongoing support of one form of the form of social structure. There's the exchange of ideas about the positive or negative nature of the group. There's also the positive and negative sanctioning of others in the group as they go about the project of showing the correct way of approaching the authority. In each type of authority, you can think of the different Weberian types. There would be different types of obeisance. There is likely a form that is developed, practiced, and mutually judged among the followers. This may come from the edict of the leader, or it may come organically from the followers. However, once established, this has the power of its own. This echoes Foucault's version of power that you discuss. And I just have to say, when I'm reading this, the thing I'm thinking of right now, I'm not thinking of religious leaders and followers. I'm thinking of anti-vaxxers, and I'm thinking of MAGA people and stuff like that, because there's this same dynamic that's going on here. And that was really something that really enlivened my reading of all of this. You've caused me to think about a couple of dimensions here. One is the difference between power and authority, with a little influence thrown into the mix. Being a sociologist who has read Parsons, well, at least my eyes have passed over the pages of Talcott Parsons, perhaps not getting what he said, I condensed the interaction between power and authority into a 2x2 table. I know that both power and authority are continuums, but for the sake of simplicity, I made them into dichotomies. In two cells where the power and authority align, there's no problem. If you have power and authority, all is aligned, and the opposite case is also true when you have neither power nor authority. The critical cells are where there is no alignment. In the case of having power but not authority, then the individual is a puppet, some kind of a shadow figure who has the instruments of power but not the legitimacy in the eyes of those who are around the individual. They can sign the decree, but they're told to do so by the real person in power. The opposite is the person without power, but who has authority. This, of course, led to the question of what is power, since it seems that you can have power without authority, but not the other way around. Having authority seems to imply that you have power. But to push this a bit further, what is it a person that does not have the formal mechanism? What is a person that does not have the formal mechanisms of power, but is seen as legitimate by the followers? This person has perhaps an informal mechanism, for example, influence. But this seems, I didn't really like that. That seemed weak. There's not the veil of legitimacy in this case. Another way to think about it is the individual has other abstract forms of power, for example, pedigree, the correct gender, wealth, the myth of privilege and entitlement, etc. But they do not have direct control of the social mechanisms with which to exercise their will. This might be Trump after he finally leaves office in the eyes of the MAGA people. In this case, he will not have direct access to the formal parts of power that he had in office, but he will have, in the eyes of the MAGA people, legitimacy that facilitates the execution of his will. This tracks on Luke's notion of power that includes formal decision-making power. You have your hands on the levers and can move them. The ability to, the next level, according to Luke, is the ability to set the agenda. And finally, there's ideological power. Trump will not have the first of these, but for some, he will have the latter too. So that was trying to explode that idea of authority and power. I know I'm straying from the idea of religious power and authority, but my thoughts on groups like QAnon are in many ways a secular religion. Following this line, though, the notion of an ideology isn't important. In any group that wants to maintain itself that way, they need to have an ideology. For example, we are told there's the idea that we are the victims of the deep state or something to that effect. The main framework of an ideology is not enough. This will have to be fed with a set of incidents either constructed or naturally occurring, that can be seen as illustrations of how the main ideology is true. It might be the artificially constructed idea that they don't count the votes right. Yeah, that's just another example of our persecution by the deep state. Or it might be something as banal as I got a parking ticket when I have always parked in that space. Yeah, it's just another example of our persecution by the deep state. In other words, people have to have some sort of recurring evidence that they're somehow a victim of the deep state. In general, any version of I got unnecessarily hassled by the deep state can fit into this line of narration. Regardless, there needs to be a feed of these events in order to maintain the vitality of the ideology and their support of that position. Going back to the 2x2 Parsonian table, I can imagine a situation where, to use your relational framework, people attribute the leader with a sense of authority. They see the leader as legitimate, but the leader has only attenuated access to the formal and informal power. This type of authority is perhaps most common in charismatic or quasi-charismatic groups. Another thing I start to think about is the boundary between religion and a movement. I think, for example, QAnon, the anti-vaxxer movement, are examples. Defined leaders of these movements have a similar position to a self-proclaimed religious leader. This brings me over to the issue of factoring in the digital dimension. When I was writing New Tech, New Ties, I was in a type of dialogue with Randall Collins, a sociologist, or rather with his book. I was interacting with him a little bit, but rather his book, Interaction Ritual Chains. In that book, he basically says that rituals of social cohesion must be face-to-face. They must be co-located. You can't do it in a remote way. In many ways, this assertion is the motivation for me to write my book. My response to Collins was that cohesive rituals can be mediated. But to do that, it is often best that there's at least some face-to-face interaction, some co-located and some mediated types of interaction. Following Parks' social dynamics can be totally mediated, but they are quite rare, Malcolm Parks. However, there is some combination of co-located and mediated interactions possible to have a cohesive ritual. And just to sort of, throw in a little bit more sociology, the basic idea that I go into is the Durkheimian form of cohesive rituals, where there's mutually recognized focus, the engenderment of common mood, barriers to those who are not part of the group, common recognition of shared status, allegiance to based on minor transgressions against the norms, and there are also power dimensions. Some of these things you can do in a mediated form, but some are very difficult to do via mediated interaction. There's also the issue of how followers can pull this off when they're not co-present. That said, for example, the QAnon people seem to be quite good at doing all of this. This brings me to my last point. I wonder, however, if a digital version of this is the full deep down in your bones type of cohesion that you would get in a co-located type of ritual interaction. Is a totally digitally based cohesion possible? Can you go from a non-aligned to a deeply committed people? Is there that tight boundary grouping? This type of group or their strong bonds of reciprocity and a legacy of supporting one another in a totally mediated communication. Alternatively, is the bond more situational? Is it true that digitally based indexing of likes or followers is a way of understanding relatively popularity of one another? This can fold back into the co-located forms of connection and the motivation to carry out various actions. The QAnon system or the anti-vaxxer movement function in this way. Following that, digital movements tick off many of the social cohesion boxes noted above. However, aside from the most dedicated followers, I wonder whether the whole person becomes a part of this. Is the leader-follower bond a synergetic interaction? Is the interaction of the followers tightly bonded relationship? Is there some internal discipline among the followers for those who stray or threaten to stray? Or rather, is there a mode of a temporal alignment? I wrote my dissertation on what I called social constructions of synthetic charisma. Charisma is the part, and that's where I sort of tie into Heidi's work on charisma. My point was that politicians evoke elements of charisma, but it's not the full Monty. The social construction part comes from Berger and Luckman and plays on the idea of the leader and the follower constructing what they see as an institution. As part of this process, they develop an ideology and carry out a legitimation process. Thus, there is the Weberian notion of authority, an echo of the Foucault structure that you discuss, as well as the interactive processes you described. In the case of my dissertation, I found that there was a resonance with the Weberian authority, but it was a weak, synthetically constructed and situational version. In a similar way, I wonder if one of the ideas you're playing with is type of synthetic authority in the digital context.